I come before you today wearing a hairy garment like the prophets of old. That's a little joke, but I constantly have dog hair on my clothes in the morning because we rescued this dog, and she gets really excited when she sees me each morning. She's very, very happy, and she likes little hugs. And unfortunately, she's shedding. So I have a hairy garment this morning to deliver what is actually a serious message, but we'll break the ice with that little joke. I want to talk about the fruits. Yeah, I'm also itchy because I have dog hairs floating on my face. I want to talk about the fruits of righteousness. Specifically, we read about how we're supposed to recognize true messengers based on the fruits that they bring. Fruits are an interesting subject. What is unique about fruit in the scriptural sense? It produces after its own kind. It will create the same thing it came from. And this similitude is very important. The kingdom of God is a network, and it's a hierarchical network. The higher up you go, the closer to God you get. And that's true in terms of your own progress, and it's true in terms of the hierarchy as a network of people. And so the angels around the throne of God, for instance, are much closer to him than all the other ones. And that's not just in a geographical sense, a spatial sense. They are closer to him in character because distance from God and similitude to God are inseparable. And there are a lot of reasons for that that are beyond the scope of this video. So as servants of God, what we all should be trying to do is to help others take upon themselves the qualities of Christ that we have already obtained. We are helping others to come up to whatever we have received. And the goal is to become redundant, meaning that independent of us, they have obtained those qualities and will retain those qualities. Now that's a high goal. And in most cases, people prefer to keep a lower law, a law that's dependent in nature. So the Israelites organizing themselves under Moses and being quite content to remain there. Moses, go and speak with God on our behalf. We don't want to go up the mountain. But they had the offer, they could have gone, right? So unfortunately, when it comes to evaluating the fruits of messengers, people go about this in strange ways, but they've become mainstream, for lack of a better way to describe it. We would do well to go back to the scriptures and study the many examples we have of these sorts of things. For example, we see different kinds of people following the Lord himself during his mortal ministry, Paul, Peter, all of these people. And the vast majority of them, numerically, the vast majority of them did not get it. Many of the same people welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem, riding triumphantly on a donkey, as prophesied, consented to his death, or at least did nothing to stop it. And so it's common to have people that are quite excited about a message and yet don't live it. Or they stay with it for a little while and then they later reject it. And the most bitter enemies of the truth once believed it. And so we see this in the parable of the sower, for instance, the description of the different places that the seed was cast and how it grew or stopped over time and what overcame it. And a lot can be gleaned from this parable. We also see people like Paul shutting down some of the folks who seemed most excited about the message that he brought, because he could see that they were actuated by influences that were not as good as they thought. I'm trying to say that diplomatically. Essentially, a key characteristic of most people who are influenced by the devil is that they don't know it. The devil tries to keep himself secret as long as he can. He's very strategic about how he works. But with greater light, you can see greater darkness. And people who have lived in a state of dishonesty, they lose the ability to see what might be more obvious to a more honest person. And it's just as obvious as the dog hair on my vest to a person who's honest, whereas it could be completely invisible to the person themselves. And so you have these crazy people, you have these traitors, you have these people who aren't motivated in the ways they'd like to think that they are. And it really complicates things as far as trying to see the fruits, trying to evaluate the message by the fruits. So how do you cut through all the noise? You know, where there is signal, there will be noise. And the stronger the signal, the more noise there will be. We tend to look for things that are clean. But unfortunately, in this complex world in which we live, it's not that simple. And actually, if we impose that constraint on the search for greater truth, we will come up short-handed. We'll miss the best things. Jesus himself, Jesus Christ himself, was preceded by a bunch of false messiahs. And the people were tired of these imposters. Meanwhile, a whole class of, well, how can I say this? The entire mainstream religion had been corrupted so extensively that those who tried to identify new truth by how well it aligned with what they already believed failed from the start. They didn't see any value in the Lord. They saw him as an apostate, in fact, the least likely person to be who he claimed to be. That's what it means to be a marred servant, by the way. It's a very special word in the Old Testament. We read about that in Isaiah. So how do you cut through the noise to get to the signal? Here's the key. Are you ready? I need to go downstairs and to the drums so I can give you a drum roll. Here's the key. You pay attention to the people who listen to the message, not the people who get excited about it, not the people who obviously fight it, right? The people who accept the invitations to improvement. In John 7:17, the Lord said very clearly, those that do what he says will know that it comes from the Father. So does that mean that you need to adopt every potential idea that comes across your path? Of course not. You do it in a regulated way, one step at a time. But you can take advantage of other people who have adopted more of it than you. You don't have to go to college for a bunch of years and get a PhD in some field before you have any clue of how that's going to go. Look at people who have already done it. At the same time, why would you think that some totally unrelated thing that has nothing to do with that would be evidence for or against it? If you want to evaluate the value of a message, you have to pay more attention to the people who are living it than those who aren't, right? That's the test. If you want to, you can experiment with it directly for yourself. And if you've been given sufficient reasons, you should. But the most sufficient reason is an example of someone who's done it, right? But you don't look at someone who hasn't done it and say, well, it didn't go the way we were promised, so therefore it's false or it's not good. This is such basic common sense that maybe you think I'm silly for having to say this, but if you're paying attention, it's necessary to say this, right? Okay, so now let's pivot. Why is it important to have people who serve as examples of messages that are purported to come from God? This is why. This is why. And so the people with greater faith, and what I mean by that is a greater willingness to a willingness to act and a capability to discern sufficient reasons to act. Those kinds of people are the early adopters of any idea. And then they reduce the barrier of acceptance, because now instead of needing to have the wisdom to think critically about a new idea and evaluate something on intellectual merit, for lack of a better phrase, using logic and honesty and intelligence, things that people tend to lack in, those people can now be living examples, become living examples of this thing, this idea, and it makes it so much easier for people to evaluate its worth, right? So I'll give you a real world example of this that has nothing to do with anything religious on the surface, but it does have to do with fruit, right? I spent years of my life doing backbreaking work and spending a lot of money digging holes and planting a bunch of different kinds of apple trees here. And I live in an area that's basically USDA Zone 3, although it's advertised as Zone 4. All the neighbors, everybody I asked who lives around here, who's into gardening, said, you can't grow apples. It's not possible here. It's too cold. The weather's not good. It's too dry. Well, through extensive experimentation, ridiculous amounts of work and money, I've found a solution to the problem. And there is a set of apples that grow really well here. After I did it, people we know who came and saw and tasted the fruit, literally, right? They said, hey, a surprising number of them said, hey, can you tell me how to do this? Sure, and I did. And for just the cost of the 3 or 4 trees that they wanted, instead of thousands and thousands of dollars, and for just the time of digging a hole for those specific trees, instead of hundreds of holes for many trees that didn't work out in the end, they were able to have the same fruit, right? They're the same tree varieties. In the apple world, they're actually clones. If it's the same name apple, it's the same tree genetically, which is crazy, right? That's an example of how this works. The number of people who are willing to copy something is massively greater than the number of people who are willing to innovate something, to discover something. Okay? So hopefully this is making sense. We need more people who are examples of the things that the Lord is revealing through heaven, from heaven. These invitations for improvement, we need people who actually do it, not just people who get excited about the idea. This is something I brought up explicitly in the last talk I gave in Utah. I said something like, you're not special just because you come to a talk. If you want to be better, you have to actually be better. Now, what an amazing thing it is that the process of actually improving is such a novel thing among people who claim to be Christian. What are modern churches? They're holding tanks for people who already have a set of beliefs and who are never going to change. They're never going to become better. If you know any of those people, there's not one day they come home from church and decide to make a significant change in their life. That's not what they're known for. You know, these people, they talk about churches being like hospitals for the spiritually sick. What hospital wouldn't immediately go out of business if it was as bad at helping people be better as churches are today? And yet people waste enormous amounts of time and money on these organizations. Really what they're doing is paying them to tell them that they're good enough already. But they're not. When God gives us invitations to improve and he shows us a better way, it comes with the responsibility to do it. And do you know what happens when we don't? It's not a thing of, hey, do what I say or else I'm going to punish you. The consequences of disobedience to God, the consequence of taking lightly invitations to improvement, is you're on your own when the thing it would have protected you from comes. That's the problem. That's the issue. We're living in a time where a flood of invitations to improve has come and continues to flow. Guess what comes with that? Consequences, for better or for worse. And if you disregard these things, you are going to encounter the problems they're designed to solve, but you will do so on your own. God is constantly handing us ladders to get out of these pits. And the first pit is the pit we dig for ourselves by willingly disobeying him. But then even when we start to do our best in all things, and hopefully succeed at that, so we can say, I always do what I believe is best in all things, he still continues to hand us ladders, because the Church of Christ is not a holding tank for people who have it all figured out. It's a ramp, and it goes all the way to Christ himself. If you don't have a constant face-to-face relationship, the most intimate relationship you could ever imagine having in a non-romantic way, I mean, of course, with another person, if you don't have that with the Lord Jesus Christ, then there is so much more that he wants you to have. And if you're not moving towards that in a way that you can sense and perceive, in real ways that you could sit down if you wanted to and explain to a person the last 4 things that were significant that God taught you, that you had to change to align with, you're not in the way. So it's time to get with it, because the pits are still there, and if you're still in it, you're going to be in even more trouble as the floods rise, and they're rising. The water is flowing. All around me, I see people suffering in ways that are completely avoidable. Completely. There is a great deal of suffering that's unavoidable, and it's very beneficial. It's baked into the pie. It's part of creation. It's critical for us getting to know God better, increasing in the eternal joy we will have, and helping others while we're here. But if you had to draw a pie chart of the suffering that most people are going through in life, it is completely avoidable, and it doesn't help. It helps in the sense that hopefully if you get beaten over the head enough, you'll finally wake up and start seeking God for real. But that's it. That's the limit of its benefit. So get with the program and start living the invitations to improve that you've heard of. If you hear about a way to be better and it checks out, you have thought about it, you've done due diligence on it, and it seems to work, or you see someone who did that thing or stopped doing that non-beneficial thing and they're better off for it, why wouldn't you do it yourself? The time is short, and I'm telling you, the degree of consequence for these things is just cranking up by the moment. And you can see it. If you open your eyes, you can see it. So let's get with it, and let's provide more examples to people of what more God has to offer and how much better things can be. And instead of just arguing someone's opinion versus someone's opinion, we can have real evidence of how this works in our lives, real problems that we've overcome, answers to questions that other people can't answer, and so on and so forth. Greater resilience to change and surprise. We should be different. As disciples of Christ, we should be different than those who are not, and we should be better. Not so we can rub their faces in the dirt and lord it over them, but so that we can reach out our hands to them and bring them up to where we are, with hopes that they keep going, to really have something to offer other people to help them. The time where you can just get excited about ideas and be counted among some group that thinks they're special because they have different ideas about things, but they don't actually do anything differently, is over. Pick up the invitations, plant the seeds in your own lives, and have fruit to offer to other people.